When COVID first came to prominence in 2020, I wasn't someone who dismissed it straight away, out of hand. My initial response was to take a step back and to just try and assess what I was seeing. There were a lot of things that were happening all at once on a global scale, and I wanted to try to process as much of this information as possible before reaching my conclusion, my stance, my response to the whole thing. But what I would say is that I very quickly began to feel that what I was seeing was not adding up. This would be within the first month or two even. I began to feel manipulated. I became very skeptical of the whole thing and distrustful of world leaders and suspicious of the motivation behind their ideology. Indeed, in the passing of time, I came to dismiss COVID as a kind of manufactured hysteria, really. And I think there are probably 10 reasons that brought me to that conclusion. I think the first thing that piqued my interest and that bothered me early in COVID and made me think that's a very strange thing that we're doing right there was the way that deaths were being counted. In the UK, an official COVID death was someone who had died within 28 days of testing positive. This seemed to be a needlessly vague way of measuring, and it meant that someone could have COVID, recover from it, be hit by a bus a week later, and that would be chalked up as a COVID death. That seems strange to me. If someone dies from a skydiving accident, but they had the flu the week before, nobody puts that down as a flu death. So why were we doing this with COVID unless someone was trying to inflate the numbers? Speaking of flu, another thing that seemed suspicious was that flu apparently ceased to exist for about 2 years. In 2021, Public Health England recorded no flu cases at all. Now, call me cynical, but it seemed that what was really happening was that flu still existed, but that it was being grouped in with COVID and it was being declared as a COVID case. And again, why would anyone do this unless they were trying to inflate the numbers? Even using the inflated numbers, it seemed to me, with just a quick glance at the statistics, that unless you were elderly, obese, or had another underlying health condition, your chance of dying from it was really extremely low. COVID had never represented a massive threat to the majority of the world's population. The British Medical Journal found that the overall death rate in the UK was about 0.66%. Now, for flu, for context, it's about 0.3%. So not much of a difference. And we don't panic about flu. We don't have lockdowns and tell people to wear masks and shut churches and businesses for flu. And yet the difference between the two diseases is not that much. If you're a child, there was a 0.0016% chance of dying. So children really had nothing to worry about at all. And really, it's only if you were elderly that it began to rise to 7.8%. But we never really heard about this. Instead, the media constantly whipped people up, insisting that it was an equal danger to everyone. And this was clearly just not true. Something that was used to whip people up into a frenzy was apocalyptic computer modeling. And very early on, it became apparent that this computer modeling was wildly inaccurate and was presenting these ridiculous doomsday scenarios. We were constantly bombarded with these predictions that if we didn't lock down or wear masks or take the vaccine or give up our liberties or whatever it may have been, millions and millions of people were going to die and the bodies would start piling up in the street. And yet in every single circumstance, these predictions were proved massively overstated. Indeed, almost everyone now recognizes that these models were so flawed, they should never have been used to make policy decisions at all. The modeling that led to lockdown was totally unreliable and flawed. I think a lot of us could see this early on, that nothing the scientists were predicting was coming remotely true. And yet, suspiciously, it didn't seem to matter how many times they were wrong, how many times they made false predictions. They kept their jobs, they kept turning up on TV, and their next set of predictions were still being used to justify the next set of draconian rules. And that made me suspicious. How many times do you have to be proved wrong and incompetent before people stop listening? How many times can you cry wolf before people stop paying attention? For me, that came very early on in the process. I think what became apparent through all of this was that we were being deliberately fear-mongered. The threat was being deliberately overstated by politicians and through the media. And when people try to fear-monger, it's because they're trying to control and manipulate you. When something genuinely scary happens, leaders that are looking out for you will try to calm your fears so that you think rationally about the best course of action. Think of the existential threat that we faced in World War II. And Winston Churchill became famous for his speeches where he tried to calm and encourage the nation. We're going to fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them on the fields. We'll never surrender. Don't worry about it. We're going to get through this together. We're going to win. That's what true leaders do. They try to calm and encourage. When people are deliberately trying to amplify the fear, however, When they're trying to stoke that fear, they're trying to get you into a state of irrationality so that we become easier to manipulate and control. So when I saw this inaccurate apocalyptic modeling and this overstated threat, I began to think, why are they trying to manipulate us? What's the goal here? There's a political agenda at work here. And it turned out to be the case. It emerged during COVID that the UK government had a department called the Nudge Unit. And the sole job of this Nudge Unit was to think of ways of how to scare the public so they would be more compliant. Matt Hancock, who is the UK's health secretary through COVID, has had his secret WhatsApp messages leaked. And in them, he talked to his advisor saying he deliberately wanted to frighten the pants off everyone with a new strain. Why? Well, the advisor replied, yep, that's what will get proper behaviour change. And then Hancock responded eagerly saying, when do we deploy the new variant? When I saw the government was deliberately trying to scare people in order to control and manipulate them, I stopped listening to what they had to say and I began asking, what's really going on here? You politicians don't believe what you're telling us. So what's really going on here? What's the ideology? What is the end goal? I think probably the main thing that convinced me that there was something else going on in COVID and there was a political ideological angle to it was the hypocrisy of the leaders. Government officials would stand behind podiums and with these grim faces declare that we were facing this existential threat and that if we didn't follow their rules, wear masks, stay inside, close businesses, close churches, take this vaccine, avoid social contact, we were all going to die, the bodies would start piling up in the street. And then as soon as the cameras were off, it emerged very early on in the process, these stories began to leak, that these same people were then going on bike rides and were traveling across the country on day trips, going on family days out, having smooches with their assistants, having birthday parties, and then joking about it. Even in the Prime Minister's house in 10 Downing Street and in his back garden, they were having parties. The First Minister of Wales was pictured dancing around without masks as well. A lot of people became mad at this, but mad for the wrong reasons. You see, many people saw this behaviour and still being under this false illusion that COVID was a massive threat, said, how can they socialise and party? They're going to kill people. What they should have been saying was, hang on a second, the politicians are clearly not scared of COVID. So why are we? They're the ones that have access to all the information. And if they genuinely thought that COVID was this massive death sentence, they wouldn't be partying. The fact that they're doing this should tell us it's really not that big a deal. And when they stand behind podiums and tell us that it is, they're lying. They don't believe a word of it. You see, I didn't have a problem with any of these people partying and living life during COVID. What made me furious was that they tried to stop us from doing the same thing. And worse, they stopped people from running a business so they could feed their families, from going to church so they could worship God, from visiting their loved ones when they were ill, stopped them being with them as they died even. They stopped them from attending their funerals even. To do that for political ends is wicked. When you know that what you're saying is overstated and it's a lie, to stop people from doing those things is wicked. They knew it wasn't that bad. They knew they were lying, and yet they still stopped people from doing these very important things for merely political ends. That, to me, is what I was furious about. Something else that made me very suspicious was how many of the laws the government imposed were against common sense. You don't need to be a scientist to know that if there's a respiratory virus going around, being in the fresh air, in the outdoors, in the mountains is literally the safest place you can be. It's low population density and it's literally filled with fresh, clean air. I can go walking in the mountains around here in Scotland and not see another human being the entire day. And yet people were arrested for going outside, for walking their dogs in the fresh air, for going into the hills. This is against common sense. It's also against common sense to say that wearing a mask all day is good for our health. Clearly breathing back in what you've just breathed out is not going to be healthy. And yet they tried to force people to do this. And then there were all these other silly rules about not having to wear a mask if you were sitting down, but having to wear one if you were standing up. There was something about a Scotch egg as well, but I think by that time I'd just given up and I wasn't caring anymore what they were saying. So there was something about a Scotch egg though. When I heard these things, it was just further confirmation that the government wasn't being driven by science, but by ideology and politics. It wasn't about health, it was about control. Because of these things, I began to see the government as being far more dangerous and sinister than any virus. I was dismayed at how they so easily suspended freedom and democracy and given themselves the power to do all of these things, whether it be stopping free citizens from going to the beach or going into the mountains, locking people inside their homes, inflicting all these arbitrary and silly rules, and then imposing really harsh penalties on people for disobedience, and how they basically turned us into a version of communist China. From 2005 to 2011, Professor Robert Dingwall was part of a team that was tasked with creating a pandemic plan for the UK. It was a sensible plan, and it involved keeping society going and keeping the economy open. However, when COVID hit, those plans were completely discarded, and instead politicians copied communist China instead. Robert Dingwall now says, looking back, you could say that some of us were a little naive about what would happen when a pandemic finally took hold. The crisis presented an opportunity to use the power of the state to remodel society and the way individuals relate to it without democratic consent or respect for the rule of law. So my main concern throughout COVID was not a virus, but how the government were using this as a pretext to remodel society and to move us down this authoritarian path. And that's now set a really dangerous precedent, because now that democratic governments know that democracy and freedom can be suspended if people perceive there to be a big enough threat, you can bet your bottom dollar that they will now overstate other threats in the future to give themselves that same power. As many of you will know, I believe there's a globalist elite who would like to see a one world government established in the near future. And something else that bothered me about COVID was how it was clearly being used to further that aim as well. The World Health Organization, which approved these authoritarian measures for COVID and which has been proven to be compromised by communist China, are now trying to get national governments of the world to sign a treaty which would hand them complete control in the case of future pandemics. So no longer would policy be decided by elected national politicians, but by unelected, faceless globalists who would have the power to dictate the behavior of every person in the world. These globalists could lock people in their homes again if they so chose, or do anything else. This is very sinister and, in my view, completely unacceptable. Something else I thought was sinister and was suspicious was how dissenting voices were suppressed during COVID. There was a time, and it still may exist actually, I'm interested to see what happens with this video and whether we're allowed free speech again on this topic, but there was a time when you weren't. There was a time when if you said anything against the accepted COVID narrative, you were actively suppressed on social media and in society. There was a determination amongst the elite that only one opinion and only one voice would be heard, and that no debate or discussion was allowed. And this to me is further evidence of an ideology being at work. True science would have allowed all voices to be heard and discussed. Indeed, very early on, a group of scientists got together to write the Great Barrington Declaration, which was an open letter putting forward some different ideas, opposing lockdowns. But this was very quickly suppressed. And again, this is evidence of an ideology. This makes me very suspicious when the government are determined to shut down certain voices. Something that convinced me that we were dealing with a kind of hysteria, a kind of fear-induced mania during COVID, rather than a rational scientific response to which I should give some credence, was that everyone developed, or not everyone, but the government and a large swathe of the population developed this monomaniacal fixation on it, as it was the only problem that mattered. When the government imposed lockdowns, voices tried to speak up, talking about the collateral damage of that, saying you're going to harm people in other ways. Children's education and social development is going to be stunted. It's going to create depression problems if you isolate people from one another, and that'll lead to deaths through physical abuse and suicide. If you redirect all healthcare resources to COVID, people are going to start dying more from other diseases like cancer, because those things still exist. Those things haven't gone away. The economy is going to crash if you switch it off. There's going to be inflation and financial issues for people further down the line. All of this was ignored by the government, and again, it has to be said, large swathes of the population who remained monomaniacally fixated on COVID as though it was the only bogeyman that mattered. And as a result, all these predictions about the collateral damage of lockdowns has come true. The fact people weren't thinking rationally about these things and couldn't have foreseen these things at the time proves that there was a kind of mania, a kind of hysteria in the air, because they weren't thinking rationally. And of course, a lot of these people are now saying, well, who could have known? Who could have predicted that this would happen? And then the rest of us are on the side saying that's exactly what we said was going to happen, but you weren't thinking rationally at the time because you were overcome by this hysteria. The final reason why I became suspicious of the COVID response and began to feel manipulated was that it became clear to me that there was a lot of money being made from this situation, and that part of the reason it was being so stoked and so hyped was because it suited the wallets of a great many powerful people. Professor Robert Dingwall, whose original pandemic plan had been ignored, said, "We underestimated the opportunities for private gain, both in the commercial sense, think of the taxpayer-funded millions spent on testing, PPE, contact tracing, and Perspex screens, and in the sense that COVID-19 led to greatly increased funding for biomedical research. When I realized that it was financially expedient to pretend that COVID was a much bigger threat than what it was, and that it was making millionaires, my skepticism really reached new heights. And that's especially true when I discovered that Rishi Sunak, who was then the British Chancellor, is now the British Prime Minister, he'd invested heavily in Moderna and stood to make a massive profit from the Moderna vaccine. When I discovered that, that was just the tip of the iceberg. I really began to feel manipulated and I began to switch off from the whole hysteria. If I tried to summarize all these points and put it into a single sentence, it would be that I began to feel that world leaders were deliberately fear-mongering for political ends, for power, control, money, and to reshape society for an ideological purpose. And when I reached that conclusion, I began to view the hysteria around COVID with a sense of curious, detached bewilderment. I just got on with my life. I stopped watching the news and paying attention to the daily updates. I had no idea what the latest rules were anymore because I wasn't following them, and I just came to regard them all as nonsense. In fact, my main memory of COVID is that for 2 years, the government were constantly, every single day, basically just going, woo, be more scared, everyone. There's a new variant, Omicron. You got to do what we say. You can't eat eggs anymore. You got to eat sandwiches standing on your head. You got to hop on one foot when you go to the bathroom. And every so often I catch a glimpse of this on TV and kind of go, what? No. Anyway, more pizza and just got on with daily life. But still, some people remained intensely fearful during that whole 2-year period. So every so often I'd hear one of them saying something like, have you heard there's a new variant? Billions of people are going to die. It's in the chickens. You can't eat chicken anymore. You can go 10 miles, but you can't go 11 or everyone's going to die. And I just thought, why are you allowing yourself to be so manipulated still by these silly rules when it's clearly not that big a threat? I wouldn't argue or get riled up about it because I thought this is everyone's right to react to this however they choose. If they want to work themselves up into a state and cower in a corner at home, it's their life. They're allowed to do that. But I'm going to go and live mine. But that just seemed to rile them up even further, that you weren't as scared as them. Why aren't you as scared? Why aren't you doing the same things as the rest of us are doing? You must be evil. You should be locked up. You should be forced to take the vaccine. You should lose your job. Many of you will know this from firsthand experience. I know I received many emails from people who nearly lost their job over this. So you'll know this firsthand, that it became common to be absolutely reviled just because you weren't scared, because you knew this was all a kind of madness and you were just waiting for it all to blow over. Now that the hysteria has died down a little bit, I think a lot of the people who were caught up in the madness are now feeling a little bit embarrassed about their reaction. It's like the spell has been broken. It's like the fear has fallen away and they're now a bit embarrassed about the person they became during those 2 years. Many people really turned into tyrants back there. And I think this is coming out in the fact that they tried to call an amnesty recently where they basically said, look, we're now feeling a little bit silly about our behavior back there. It turns out that you people who weren't getting caught up in the hysteria, turns out you may have been right. So let's just pretend it didn't happen. Let's just excuse our behavior. Let's pretend we didn't say those things about locking you up and making you lose your job and refusing you healthcare, and that we didn't turn into those tyrants. And then of course the people on the other side are going, no, hang on a second. Let's rewind. Let's remind ourselves about exactly what you said. I certainly think that with every passing day, people who didn't get caught up in the COVID hysteria are now feeling more and more justified about that. I know a lot of people who took the vaccine that are now bitterly regretting it, but I don't know anyone who refused the vaccine who now regrets that decision. However, that leads me on to the final part of this video, because I feel that history is in danger of repeating itself right now and that lessons haven't been learned from COVID. The same things that whipped people up into an irrational hysteria during COVID, I think are now being used to do exactly the same thing around climate change. Now, I'm not a climate change denier in the same way I'm not a COVID denier. I don't have a problem with the idea that climate is fluctuating, and as Christians, I think we should be thinking of ways to look after this earth. This earth is a gift from God. We should look after it. I don't have a problem with this idea that climate changes over time. That's what it does. But I think this is being whipped up into an hysteria in the same way that COVID was. Overstated threat, apocalyptic and inaccurate computer modeling, fear-mongering to force behavioral change, hypocrisy from world leaders, nonsensical laws, using it as a pretext to power grab and ideologically reshape society, moving us towards globalism, quashing of dissent, monomaniacal fixation that ignores collateral damage of policy decisions, and a money trail that's making some people very, very rich. I feel like these exact same things are being deployed again for climate change. So I just want to say, let's learn the lessons from COVID and let's not be afraid this time, because being afraid makes us really easy to manipulate.